Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Water Boys with your host, Derek Lambert. We have co-host Luther G. Williams, Dr. Luther G. Williams with us. How's it going, brother?
Oh, Derek, it's going wonderful. You know, I'm excited about today's guest. Freethinker, author, teacher, speaker, debater, anthologist, columnist, editor, podcaster, and heretic, of course, and some would say the number one mythicist scholar on this big blue marble we call Earth, Dr. Robert M.Price. Pretty good.
Adrian!
What's going on, Dr. Bob?
Oh, just sitting here sweating in the supposed autumn weather in North Carolina. But, having a good time anyway, working on my newest book, Jesus Christ Superstition, and having a lot of fun with that.
He has, you know, Bob, you've got the most provocative titles, and you know, you're noted for that now, so, and you never disappoint. But you were talking about the weather in your neck of the woods and in Derek's. I just wanted to mention we had this major storm. How'd you and your family fare through that?
We had a couple of days of pretty heavy rain and pretty strong winds, but I wouldn't have known it was a hurricane. We had really no damage. A few days later, we had a slight bit of property damage when a guy driving a truck suddenly had a seizure and plowed into our fence, but that wasn't the storm's fault. And so we came through it unscathed. And, of course, the reason for that is that I am God's favorite on earth, even though I don't believe in him.
Well, look,
sounds about right.
Something that needs to be noted before we get started, because we have so much meat in this program that we're going to want to get into. I first want to emphasize, if you like Dr. Bob's stuff, or you're interested in seeing more of this stuff that we're going to be talking about and much, much more, he's all over the place with his discussions. Very, very interesting guy. Lots of information. And if you want to support him, he's got a couple websites. They're here on the Blog Talk website. They're on Facebook. And we're also going to get this thing on YouTube. So in the description under the YouTube video, you'll be able to see robert.m.price.com. You want to go there. robert.m.price.mindvendor. That's mindvendor.com. He has many books. He has Patreon accounts. He has help support him. Guys, this is, you know, he's treasured here. This is how he makes a living. So if you're able to help and support that, what's that song we put on here? Let's see. Let's give it a hear.
That's what I'm talking about. Let's get some bills paid.
Yep.
Yeah, it's I make my living, or one might say fail to make a living at this, but it's worthwhile.
Absolutely. Guys, Mythicist Milwaukee hosted this debate between Robert M. Price and Dr. Bart Ehrman. We do not want this show to be an insult in any way, shape, or form, or anything to that aspect towards someone like Dr. Bart Ehrman. He's a brilliant man. He's brought much to the table. I still have much to learn from him, and I'm sure we have much more to learn in the future from a guy like him. He's a very well thought out person. And so I want to start off by first giving credit where credit's due, where the debate came from Milwaukee, or the Mythicist Milwaukee. And so we're going to be using clips from there, brief snippets of Dr. Bart Ehrman, and it's his opening statement. 10 clips from there we're going to play, and we're going to have Dr. Price deal with them. What do you think about that, guys?
I think it's terrific, Derek. Yeah, you know, historicist Dr. Bart Ehrman didn't just wake up one day and decide, as we've heard very recently, that he doesn't want to debate mythicist Dr. Richard Carrier. I like to think that the issues that were exposed in the debate we're going to hear in the 2016 debate with you, Dr. Price, set the stage for his cautious attitude. So we got the idea to do a reboot on that debate, and we're all excited about it.
I just need to point out, though, I got to know Bart, and at that debate, I really like him a lot. He's a friend, and like you, I have great respect for him. But his reluctance to debate Richard is not because of any lack of confidence in his own arguments. It's just that in extensive reviews of Bart's work, Richard is so two-fisted and well, I'm not even sure if maybe you want to use the word tactless in it. He really goes to town. And I can understand why Bart would fear that would be just a distasteful experience. I think it really is the medium, not the message there.
Okay, great. Well, are you excited about the reboot as we are? Let's get to it, huh, Derek?
Sounds like fun.
All right.
Absolutely. I'm super excited. Guys, let's not waste any more time because this is extremely important. And just so everyone who's listening knows, this is just the beginning. We have many more shows I'd love to have with Dr. Price. And like I said, show him some love. So let's dig right into it. Round one. Here's Bart Ehrman. My bad.
This is obviously an important issue for you, and it should be an important issue for everybody. I mean, if Jesus didn't exist, that would be a big deal. There are 2 billion people in the world today who worship Jesus. Christianity completely changed Western civilization. There has been nothing like Christianity that has affected such change in the history of the West. Nothing. This is actually the topic of the book that I'm working on now, is how Christianity took over the Roman Empire. But realize if Christianity had not become the religion of the West, we simply would not have the cultural history we've had. Whether you're thinking in terms of art or literature or music or architecture, our lives would be incalculably different. If Jesus never lived, this is a religion based on a myth. I myself am not a believer in Jesus, but I do believe in history, and I believe it's important to know what actually happened in the past, even if we would prefer that something...
Okay, so that being said, he believes in history. Do you want to go into that just a hair before we start digging into the other clips from him?
Just briefly, it seems to me we want to know what actually happened, as in the case of Kavanaugh now with being interrogated by the Senate. They want to get down to what he actually did when he was 17 years old, because that's supposed to have a big bearing on his performance as a Supreme Court justice. I don't know why you necessarily want to know that, but people figure, we got to know what kind of a guy he is or what kind of a guy he was, so let's have the FBI investigate it. Well, sometimes you really do need to know, did somebody really do this or that? But I think Bart is talking about bigger issues, and my only caution, and I don't even think he'd disagree with this, is to say that every historical judgment cannot be other than tentative and provisional. The historian deals in probability, and there is no way, short of inventing a time machine, to go back and learn what happened one way or the other 2,000 years ago. So, and you never know when new evidence will turn up, or evidence we've had for a long time may turn out to have been spurious. like the Hitler diaries. That people said, oh, boy, this gives a lot of insight into the Fuhrer and all that, and then they found out, oops, they're forgeries. Who knows when something new will knock over the apple cart, and so you really cannot have a historical consciousness and be a dogmatist. You have to say, this is where the preponderance of the evidence leads me now, in the state of the evidence. And that's it. You have to be willing to be shown wrong. And, in fact, you hope people will try to do that. It's the same in science, because you don't want to just win an argument. You want to listen to all the arguments to try to find out the truth, or at least come as close to it as you can.
Wow, Luther, you want to comment?
I'm just bowled over by the suggestion that that a historical point of view deals in probabilities. I think that's a wonderful observation. Mythicism has a chance to be on firmer ground in that respect. I mean, if we look at the human perspective on mythicism, and this is a quote from Bill Darlison, he once said that fiction is infinitely superior to history, and by implication, surer, because history happens once. Mythology is always happening. That's the difference. Just because it happened once, big deal. But if it's mythological, that means it applies to you and me. And so I come away from that saying, my, how things have changed. I mean, you take the basic tenets of mythicism, transplant them to the ancient Mediterranean world, and no big deal. What has happened to us, Dr. Price, as a species that has caused us to no longer value and appreciate myths? How do we find ourselves in this world of runaway historicists? And do you see the pendulum swinging the other way, not just among scholars, but on a grand scale?
Yeah, I think the renewed popularity of Joseph Campbell with Bill Moyer's interviews with him some years ago helped to start the pendulum swinging back to a realization of the title of that series, The Power of Myth, and more people began to appreciate it. As to why myth had fallen into disrepute in the meantime, I think that was the result of the dawn of historical consciousness and historical methods during the Enlightenment. People began to understand that the stories, mainly in the Bible, that they had always thought were historical, but also always had the power of myth behind them. They began to realize, well, geez, I guess these things didn't happen, and they wrongly thought that the only truth was factual truth. There are not other kinds of truth, and strip the power of myth away. I think the most acute case of this is secular humanism, and I guess you could add Unitarian Universalism, where they're such rationalists. And of course, you got to be rational, but they exclude anything else, and so they are afraid of. I've known humanists that didn't want kids to read Harry Potter because it might make them think there really is a supernatural, and we wouldn't want that. Well, I don't think there is, but this sounds like fundamentalism to me, like Christian parents that won't let their kids go out trick or treating because or play Dungeons and Dragons. They can't separate fiction from truth on the one hand. They take the fiction seriously as a hoax, which of course fiction is not, and they think that, and with it goes the aesthetic often, and the power of symbols and myths, and so they have a kind of scorched earth policy that really denudes the landscape of meaning and stifles imagination. I don't mean every single person, obviously, but you go to a Unitarian church service and you'll instantly see what I mean. Like somebody once said, their holiday songs are like weather reports. So, yeah, I think it became discredited because of the disappointment. Oh, you mean it never happened? But then finally people are beginning to say, well, like you did, it's happening now. That's
all right.
That's the yeah.
Well,
great.
that's a good. That was interesting. We're going to hit round 2 up, and we're going to go ahead and let Bart speak. Here we go.
First thing I want to say is the first argument that I find completely unconvincing, that some of you have heard and maybe have found convincing, is the idea that Jesus of Nazareth could not have existed because Nazareth did not exist. There was no Nazareth.
What do you think about that one there, Dr. Price?
Well, I'm not an archaeologist, but from what I've read, there really is reason to doubt that Nazareth was inhabited during the supposed time of Jesus. There has been quite a lot of archaeological research done on it, enough to show that for many centuries Nazareth was inhabited, and that sometimes it was not. It was depopulated, and then it might be revived again with new settlers. And what Renee Salm has shown is by analyzing every conceivable proposal of evidence that is artifacts found at the site of Nazareth, none of them can be convincingly or definitively dated to that period in which Jesus is supposed to have lived. They say you can't prove a negative, but that's not really the point here. You're trying to prove a positive, that there was an inhabited Nazareth at the time, and there's no archaeological evidence. I know they say every Christmas and Easter that there is. But Salm has looked into this stuff, and at most there's things that could possibly have been from there, a coin, a vase, whatever, but it's never definitive, and whereas it is on other periods. And he says that the way the evidence falls out, it appears that Nazareth was not populated at the beginning of the 1st century, though it began to be resettled in the middle of the 1st century AD or CE. And this explains a couple of things. Why that there are no references to Nazareth in Jewish literature at the time, and no archaeological evidence, but also why the gospel writers thought there had been, because in their day there was a Nazareth, and they were unlikely to be reading Biblical Archaeology Review. I doubt if they had any idea that in the recent past there hadn't been any Nazareth. And so Jesus the Nazarene may well have meant something else, because we hear from some of the church fathers that there was a Jewish Nazarene sect that survived in different forms, like the Mandeans, who called themselves the Nazareans, and that they didn't like the idea, as early Christians, that Jesus could have been a member of a sect. It's like when people say, I bet you Jesus was an Essene with the Dead Sea Scrolls people, which is not unreasonable. Orthodox believers chafe at that kind of thing, because they say, well, Jesus knew everything. He was the Son of God. He certainly wouldn't have submitted himself to the rule of some sect or order. But that's really the old problem of why would Jesus have sought baptism by John? And Matthew is very upset at that. He has John, as you know, say to Jesus, what's a nice Savior like you doing in a place like this? Why are you coming to me, or a baptism of repentance for sins? I ought to be baptized by you. And Jesus,
right.
Well, let's let it slide. It's fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. What does that mean? Well, nothing positive. It's just a way of saying, look, don't worry, reader. Jesus didn't have any sins to have forgiven. So this is simply another instance of that from a later theological viewpoint. It's disconcerting to think of Jesus as a member of a sect. And, of course, even that may be secondary. The idea that Jesus is associated with the Nazarenes may have been part of the historicizing of Jesus, if that's what happened.
Margaret Barker kind of addressed that. Margaret Barker addressed that too, Bob, in her talking about the Nazareans as opposed to the Nazareans. And she's talking about a group historically that was charged with keeping the history in the forefront of the people as sort of protectors or watchers. Are you familiar with Margaret's take on that?
No, though I think I know. I've read a bunch of her great stuff, not that, but yeah, Nazarene appears to mean keepers, keepers of the secret, keepers of the Torah, of the traditions. I guess any of those things would apply, and they would have been much like the Essenes and so on. There were many such groups. Also, we're told that the Nazareans were itinerant carpenters. And that may have something to do with why Jesus is depicted as a Nazarene. I'm sorry, as an itinerant traveling all over. Though that may be no more than a narrative device. If you've got to get from one story to another, the character has to go to some new place. But also the carpenter business, it may simply have been inferred from that. But apparently, the actual Nazareans, as opposed to Nazarenes, to exaggerate it, which would mean a person from Nazareth. And you find both spellings in the Gospels. It would explain how Jesus gets characterized and how the biography of Jesus grew in the telling.
Wow. Okay. I got an idea. We're in round 3 right now. Round 3 is a little long-winded. A couple of these will be long-winded so that Dr. Ehrman can actually get the point across, and that way our audience also is aware of what's going on here. I figure if we get through these 10 rounds, just go ahead and go straight through these. Me and Luther can go into some questions that go beyond this and delve into different ideas, and hopefully we have good timing. Does that sound like a good plan, guys? Are you down for that?
Oh, just as cogent as your dispensational chart. Ought to work fine.
Great. Okay, all right, we're on. Then with some fresh towels and a squirt in the mouth, I think we're ready for round 3, Eric.
Let's do it. You guys ready? Here we go. All right.
Second mythicist argument that people make is that if Jesus' life, as described in the Gospels, follows certain set patterns that you can see in Old Testament stories, or in myths about dying and rising gods, or in tales told about other religious figures, that if these stories are in these set traditions, then probably Jesus didn't exist. I've never found this persuasive either. Most historical figures that we have accounts of have legendary tales told about them in set patterns. That was true for George Washington. It's true for Julius Caesar. It's true for the founder of Hasidic Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov, who allegedly could heal the sick and cast out demons and raise the dead and be transfigured before his followers. Does that mean he didn't exist? No, everybody knows the Baal Shem Tov existed. There's no doubt about that. I could illustrate this by giving point after point. Let me just give you one more detailed illustration. Octavian, Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Literally, he was allegedly the Son of God. He was miraculously born. He was revered as the Son of God by his devotees. He ascended to heaven. He is a divine being worthy of worship. There are all these tales told about him. Does that mean he didn't exist? No, it means that when you tell stories about him, you tell these stories in certain ways. This is typically what happens with important figures from the past. Famous people are told in terms of stereotypes. We have our own stereotypes. We have the rags to riches story. We have the politician's sexual exploits story. We have the divine Savior story. The fact that stories are molded to a model has no bearing on whether the person actually existed or not. Now let me get to my positive.
Okay, what do you think of that one?
Well, there's a big problem as I see it, because he is certainly right. It's what Martin Debelius called the principle of biographical analogy. that you are going to encase a major historical figure in a kind of a stained glass matrix, borrowing standard myths or spontaneously recreating them, like these myths of a miraculous conception of the Buddha, of Moses or Dionysus or the Buddha, or any of these guys. Yeah, that can be tacked on to a historical figure. So that phenomenon does not automatically imply that the character is purely mythical. But the problem is that with Jesus in the Gospels, that's all you've got. We don't have any bands binding Jesus to contemporary history. There are about 3 or 4 things that are supposed to be that, but I can quickly say why they're not. Like with Caesar Augustus, with Julius Caesar, with George Washington, yeah, there are some legends, though they pale in comparison, but nonetheless. But there is so much else known and widely documented about these people, and they're so woven into the fabric of the history of their day that you can tell, yes, there has to have been a real Caesar Augustus, etc. But with Jesus, you don't have that. You've got a perfect conformity to the mythic hero archetype that Lord Raglan and others have delineated, features that appear in all manner of myths and legends, and pretty much nothing else. And what else might there be? Well, don't we have the involvement of King Herod in the Nativity story where he slaughters the innocents and all that? Well, yeah, but that looks so much like Josephus's rewrite of the Nativity of Moses, more than just the simple Exodus story. It was elaborated, and Josephus tells it the way it was believed at the time, and it sounds very much like it. Interestingly, Luke's version of the Nativity sounds an awful lot like the Nativity of Moses in Pseudo-Philo's Biblical Antiquities. I mean, so close in both cases that you really have to suspect it was borrowed. Plus, though all manner of atrocities are recorded about Herod the Great, the slaughter of the innocents, which one would think would rate a mention in this gallery of horrors, is never mentioned. And the story, as we read it, has such inconsistencies, a moving star and all sorts of things. It just doesn't appear to be very likely a historical connection. They simply replaced Pharaoh with Herod the Great, who was known to be a villain, so let's use him as one. Jesus is tied in with Caiaphas, the high priest, in the trial narrative. But that is extremely problematical, and it wasn't mythicists who pointed this out. Long ago, Jewish scholars have said, look what is said to happen. On Passover Eve, the high priest and the Sanhedrin are convening to try this guy and then turn him over to the Gentile authorities. On Passover Eve, when you had to be home with the Seder and all that, it's just somebody doesn't quite know their Judaism, apparently. It's ridiculous. It's sort of like the Pope being absent from High Mass on Christmas Eve, playing bingo instead. What else have you got? There's the Pilate business. Again, non-mythicists have long said this cannot be real. We know a decent amount about Pontius Pilate from Philo and Josephus. This guy was a Jew-hating villain. He outraged the Jews every chance he got. He would slaughter Samaritans and so forth. And yet we see him being bullied by a bunch of roustabouts outside his palace, like a scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian, and it's as if he thinks he needs their permission to condemn Jesus. And they start threatening him. Oh, we're going to tell Rome that you're letting go a supposed king of the Jews. And Pilate is already in the story said that, oh no, this guy's innocent, he's done nothing. So he's gonna listen to threats and let go Barabbas, a known killer and revolutionary. Mark says he had committed murder during the insurrection. Rome's not going to take too kindly to that. Wait a minute, Pilate, it says here that you had declared this Jesus character innocent, but you sent him to the cross and let go this terrorist? Like Donald Trump would say, you're fired. It's just utterly without any plausibility. And so it just seems to me that once these ties are cut, you have no ligaments binding Jesus to history. Every one of them is so problematic, you can tell that they're fictional. And all the rest of it is just stories that sound an awful lot like these various other myths and Old Testament stories, sometimes almost with only a name change. And if there were something else, okay, but there isn't. And I think similar problems attached to other characters who have been called mythical, like Gautama the Buddha. It seems to me highly unlikely that he existed, and I'm certainly not the first one to say it. And Apollonius of Tyana. I just had an article in the Journal of Higher Criticism. Was there a historical Apollonius of Tyana? And I analyzed the biography, and I come to the conclusion, no. I mean, you look at these stories; they're not historical in nature. Lao Tzu, people don't think he existed, though of course it's possible. Moses. The mainstream view among critical scholars is that there was no Moses, no Abraham, etc. And even Muhammad, there are some scholars that think that he was not a historical figure, but was sort of a Arabic version of Jesus. There were plenty of Arab Christians and so on and so on. So it's by no means some kind of crazy theory to say that if all you've got seems to be legend, you may not have a figure who did exist but was hyped up into a myth. You may have a myth all the way down. And one last thing, I think what historicists, those who believe in historical Jesus, what they're doing is D.M. Murdoch, Acharya S., and various others have said they're reverting to the old approach of Euhemerism from the ancient Greeks, who just couldn't believe that there hadn't been a historical Hercules, Apollo, etc., etc. And they said, well, of course, these stories are myths, but I bet you Hercules was a great strong man, and Ares was a great general, and Apollo owned a successful tanning salon or whatever, and they all got transmogrified into great myths, but they really existed. Is there any reason to think so? It's just like these guys in Hammer vampire movies say, well, usually there's a core to all these legends. No, there's not. That's the idea of you.
Mm-hmm. Bob, I'm thinking about a line from the Hammer films. You remembered Van Helsing's famous line, "The strength of the vampire is in that he is not believed."
Yeah, and that's great as a fictional prop because you have to lend some kind of plausibility to it. And right. But this assumes that there really are vampires. And so if that's the case, you could well imagine that legend has embellished the stories, like Van Helsing says in the Hammer films, that certain things that are said to affect the vamps don't really, or Stephen King in Salem's Lot, they don't really change into bats and so on, but they do suck your blood. So there's something to the thing, but we don't want to argue in a circle that there must have been something to it. There might have been, there might not have been, and Dracula's a good case. There was, as everyone knows, a historical Prince Vlad the Impaler, who was a Transylvanian prince and a great author of Bloodshed. But he wasn't a vampire. So this is not an unreasonable type of a theory. But is there any real evidence for there being a historical core? You cannot simply assume it.
Right. So Ehrman is in essence creating what I might call an artificial wedge, in that he's pointing out that there's the mythological lore, the hyperbolic lore about Jesus, but what he's not telling us is that where are the other forms of convergent evidence that I think we have a right to look for if Jesus were a historical figure? And what about the mundane evidence? What about census reports and work records, tax forms? I mean, everybody pays taxes, right? Birth and death records, records where there's no point being made. There's no propagandistic or objectionable intent, no controversy, and nothing that arouses suspicion, just the ordinary stuff. We don't find that either, do we, Bob?
No, though I will admit that even if such things existed, if Jesus were literally a carpenter, I don't think the Gospel of Mark even intends that. It was a well-known rabbinic metaphor for a scriptural exegete. But even if he was a carpenter, suppose you found receipts for things he had built. I mean, we do have such documents sometimes by sheer luck from old garbage dumps and the stuffing of book covers and stuffed alligators and tombs and all this. Oddly enough, we have loads of stuff like this, so it's not out of the question that such material would have been preserved, but then again, it's just the luck of the draw. There's no real reason it should have been. But I would say that if you ever happen to find a letter from someone, like many old papyrus letters, where a businessman on a business trip wrote back to his wife and said that, last week I was in Jerusalem and happened to hear the renowned Rabbi Jesus, who spoke words of wisdom, that would be enough to tell me, okay, there was a historical Jesus. Because here's something that somebody's writing not to prove anything, not to say this guy's the Son of God, but no evidence is no evidence. That's why I say all these judgments have to be provisional. Who knows what'll turn up? Maybe they'll find the bill for the Last Supper, like Guido Sarducci said on Saturday Night Live. Who knows? But it might happen. How do I know? I don't mean to ridicule it. I'm using the ridiculous illustrations, but suppose you did. You could, and it's just that we can't assume there was such stuff until we find it. As Jacob Neusner says, if we cannot show it, we do not know it. And I think, yeah, that's probably right. One other thing, in Bart's defense, of course, in other chapters of his book, Did Jesus Exist?, he tries to show that there is another kind of evidence, that the fact that we have the four Gospels and they appear to be based on earlier documentary sources, which in turn appear to be based on oral traditions, this would carry reports about Jesus and quotes from him back a generation or so to the ostensible time of Jesus. Well, I argue in Bart Ehrman Interpreted that you can't be sure that there were these sources like the Q source, so I think there was, but that all these source theories are just that. They're ways of trying to determine which gospel is based on which other. We don't have copies of Q, etc. And we know Matthew and Luke are based on Mark, or at least I think so. And so that's really a different kind of matter. It's not settled evidence. It's a matter of dispute. The oral tradition thing is also kind of dubious, it seems to me, and I think that was really posited as just a kind of a ad hoc way of saying, well, yeah, okay, there were loads of years between Jesus and the Gospels, but maybe the Gospel writers got it all from oral tradition, a bridge reaching back to Jesus. We don't know that there was. And finally, central to Bart's arguments like this, that these stories were circulating and these sayings were circulating just a few years from the time Jesus is supposed to have lived. Well, how could that happen if he were created out of whole cloth? Well, I say two things to that. I don't think Jesus was created like a sitcom character, that the writers decide to get together and say, hey, let's have this buffoonish character, let's have this guy in the show. That's not what happened. Rather, mythicism depicts a gradual evolution and convergence of all manner of previous mythical stuff associated with different ancient religions, and that at some point the name Jesus or the title Jesus became associated with it. It doesn't, like, if Jesus didn't exist, the bottom of this dating method just falls away. You can't say it didn't take very long for the stuff to appear about Jesus. Well, very long from when? You really can't say. It's like they're smuggling in the idea that Jesus lived at a certain time, so there wouldn't have been enough time for myths to form. Well, of course not. Yes, he lived. That's the whole point and issue. So I think his arguments are really fatally undermined by that assumption.
Well, let's continue on to number 4 here, round 4, because we've got 6 more rounds to go.
Let me get to my positive argument. Jesus of Nazareth is one of the best attested Palestinian Jews of the entire 1st century. From the year 1 of the Common Era, 1 CE, to the year 100 CE, we know that there were hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Palestine. How many of those Jews are better attested than Jesus? 1. Josephus the historian. He's attested better only because he left us multiple writings. If you look only at external attestation for first century Palestinian Jews, Jesus actually is much better than Josephus. We have 4 Gospels written about him. These Gospels come from the very next generation after his life. Contrast that with Josephus. We have 0 negative accounts of the Jewish historian Josephus. How many narrative accounts do we have for the most powerful religious figure in Jesus' day, Caiaphas, the high priest Caiaphas? We have no narrative accounts. How many narrative accounts do we have for Pontius Pilate, the most powerful man in first century Palestine? We have no narrative accounts. How many accounts do we have for anyone else in first century Palestine? We have no narrative accounts. It's not even close. I'm not saying that the gospel accounts are non-problematic. As some of you know, I've made an entire career out of arguing that they're problematic.
What do you say to that, my friend? Dr. Bob, are you there? Can you hear him, Luther?
No, we may have misplaced Dr. Price. For the moment, I'm interested in hearing his response to Bart's argument that the number of narrative accounts is something we have to take into account when looking at a historical figure, or whether a figure is historical or not. Dr. Bob, are you with us?
I hear a mumble, but it's I can't hear him. It's almost like he's on like the lowest volume you can go. If you'd like to hang up and call right back, Dr. Bob, I'll pull you in. Maybe there's something wrong with the connection or something. Oh, I can hear you a little more.
Oh, okay. Any better now?
There you go.
Okay, great. Okay, well, there are narrative accounts of Pontius Pilate in Josephus and Philo, and Philo was a contemporary. He wrote in the 40s A.D., so I'm not sure what he's getting at there. I'm sure he knows that. I must be taking it at a different sense than he meant it. But the number of accounts really don't. Well, here's that circularity again. Within a generation of when he lived, there were 4 accounts. Look, what we're trying to establish is if he lived. The bottom drops out if mythicism is true. And, of course, I'm not assuming it is. I'm just saying you can't really use that as an argument against mythicism, since mythicism presupposes a different origin of the Gospels. There are loads of accounts of the Buddha. There's a truckload of supposed contemporary hadiths of Muhammad, but these things are not judged to be authentic. There's any number of reasons you could have a bunch of Jesus stories, since they were religious texts and needed in liturgy and all of that. I just don't see how that proves anything. It's almost like the argument that there are more manuscript copies of the New Testament than there are of other ancient literature, which is ridiculous, because, not that he says that, I'm just saying it seems to me analogous to what some say. It's pretty easy to explain how, given that Christianity was a spreading religion, there would be plenty of copies of its documents, whereas you have only a few copies relatively of Euripides or Homer, because you didn't have the same kind of interest. You didn't have monks that needed copies of these things and were constantly making new ones. So as you do with the Quran, with the New Testament, with the Old Testament, and so on. So I don't find that to be hugely relevant.
So the presence of material, the presence of accounts in and of itself, you're saying, is not an argument for historical veridicality. Is that right?
Yeah, because who knows why? And in this case, it's pretty clear that the Gospels we have are interdependent. Matthew and Luke both appear to be expanded editions of Mark. They're not independent. What he's saying is a kind of another version of the old multiple eyewitnesses to a traffic accident. Naturally there are going to be some differences, but the four independently agree on what happened. That's not applicable to the Gospels, because the differences between them are usually redactional in character. You can see how one was rewritten into the other. So I don't know that it's even accurate to say there are four different accounts. Not really.
Well, come on, Bob. 40,000 Frenchmen can't be wrong, even if 38,000 of them are cloned, right?
Right. I mean, the Earth must be flat, because people used to think so. I mean, maybe it was flat at the time, but now it's round because everybody thinks it is. I mean, that's the appeal to the majority, or to the consensus. It really doesn't make any difference. I like to compare mythicism to continental drift. They used to think, I mean, within my lifetime, that whatever his name was, I can't think of it now, who propounded the theory that the continents were originally together in Gondwana or Pangaea, whatever they call it, and then split up. They used to laugh that out of the academy. I remember in geography class in junior high, people would point out, boy, it sure looks like the continents are puzzle pieces that would fit together. Oh, that's just coincidence. And then they discovered plate tectonics and said, oops, looks like this nut was right after all. It's a different way of, and this is what happens, like Kuhn in his great book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, points out that thought in any field progresses by people coming up with new ways to explain the old evidence, ways that seem to make more sense. That's how we move from geocentricity to heliocentricity and so on. Well, I think that's the case now. So today's consensus doesn't mean much. That doesn't mean the outliers like me, the marginal types, and statistically I certainly belong in that category, that doesn't mean we're right. Somehow that the minority is always right. That would be equally absurd. But the point is, you've got to deal with the evidence in a critical way, not just say, well, the mainstream view is thus and so. If the consensus of scholars settles anything, let's remember that according to the Gospels, it was the consensus of the scholars that Jesus should be put to death. And today we kind of think, gee, they made a mistake.
Right, exactly. And Bob, by the way, the continental drift, I think responsible for that is Wegener. Is that his name?
That sounds right. I think you're right.
Yeah, Alfred Wegener. That's right.
All right, guys, we're going to move on to round 5.
We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not simply one gospel in 4 forms. They are 4 gospels based on different literary and oral sources. The Gospel of Mark was probably written sometime around the year 70 of the Common Era. Jesus died around the year 30 of the Common Era. Mark is absolutely based on oral traditions that the author had heard. Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources, but they had other sources available to them. Matthew and Luke had one other source that they shared together that no longer exists. Scholars call it Q. Matthew had other sources that Luke did not have. Luke had other sources that Matthew did not have. That means prior to the writing of the Gospels, you've got sources for Mark, different sources for Matthew and Luke, different sources for Matthew, different sources for Luke, and we're not even talking about John, which didn't use Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and had different sources of his own. These are multiple independent sources from the first century. How is it possible that you have so many sources about somebody who never existed? These sources are independent of each other. They're not copying one another. You have independent sources from before the Gospels. Some of these sources have traditions in them that almost certainly go back to Aramaic-speaking Palestine. Some of these sources record sayings of Jesus in which he uses Aramaic words known only in Palestine. Some of the sources contain stories that make sense if you translate them back into Aramaic, better sense than they make when they're given in Greek. That shows the stories started out as Aramaic stories. You have Aramaic stories about Jesus from Palestine, years before the Gospels. These are stories in Aramaic Palestine that almost certainly go back to the 30s of the Common Era. Multiple sources. This is far better than anybody that we have in Palestine in the entire first century. It's better than almost anybody we have in the ancient world, with exceptions that we all could probably cite.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, this is really misleading. I don't think on purpose, but of course not. But certainly, if the Gospels are not independent, I mean, he knows and even alludes to the fact that, well, he says that Luke and Matthew each used both Mark and Q. And I think he's right. There are other theories, but I agree with that. But that kind of contradicts his whole point. They're not independent. We don't even know for sure if there was such a thing as Q, but I think there was. It makes the most sense to me of comparing the Synoptic Gospels. But this idea that this L material, the stuff that is only in Luke, not any other gospel, this M material, that's only in Matthew, or implicitly, though he didn't spend as much time on it, because he's a bit more concise than Big Mouth Bob, it seems to me that there is less and less reason to believe that this stuff came from oral tradition or any written source. It seems pretty clear to me that the uniquely Matthean stuff bears the marks of Matthean creation, and that they swarm with distinctive Matthean vocabulary that, like the descriptions of damnation, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, that appears only in Matthew as a description of hell. It's taken from a Q saying that has to do instead just with the anguish of those who find themselves excluded from the kingdom, thinking that, well, yeah, I've got a passport. I'm a Jew, so I'm safe at home. The phrase "to the consummation of the age," the use of "my Father in heaven" to a great degree. This is all Matthean. Some of the church manual stuff in chapters 18 and 19 sounds like the Dead Sea Scroll manual of discipline. The stuff about whoever says you fool to his brother will be liable to the council. That could come right out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the monastic brotherhood. And so on down the line. It sounds to me like that stuff was created by Matthew, and the same with Luke. There are a number of important Lucan parables, the Pharisee and the publican, the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, et cetera, which all have the same kind of style and structure. I think Walter Schmidtals is right that the M and L material are the creation of those evangelists. They're not separate sources of tradition. It's very obvious that's what the Gospel of John is. It seems to employ other sources, that's true, but even they are linked with the kind of stuff you find in the Synoptics and may have come from there, like the Book of Signs, where there are the 7 signs that Jesus did, and the first couple of them are enumerated. And this sounds like a certain section of Mark and Matthew, where they're the 7 similar miracles together. And then a lot of the other stuff in the Gospel of John is patently the product of that author. All the distinct vocabulary, the sentence structure, it looks just like what we find in the Epistles of John, and nothing like what we find in the other Gospels. And what I'm suggesting is the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke are more like the Gospel of John, with a substantial created amount of material by the evangelists. So these are not disparate, independent sources, but rather creative authors embellishing the original work, which to me it doesn't debunk anything. It makes it far more interesting. But it's just unreasonable to say that they're all independent sources. And again, we have this dating problem. Apologists all like to say that Mark was written around 70. There are good reasons for thinking it's written later than that, because as Hermann Dettering has argued pretty cogently, the fall of Jerusalem that Mark 13 is talking about really sounds more like the fall of Jerusalem in 135 A.D. After the defeat of Bar Kokhba, another Messiah. And if this prediction, this Mark and Apocalypse of chapter 13, was added to the Gospel of Mark, that makes it very difficult to use this to date the thing. It might have been previous to the rest of Mark, but if it was, it may be twice as young as the apologists claim. And there are various signs in the gospel that the end has been deferred, several of them. And that implies that even after the fall of Jerusalem, whichever one they mean, that still nothing happened. And I think that puts Mark into the 2nd century easily. And the other gospels that use him must be some decades after that. We don't really hear of them before Irenaeus in the late 2nd century.
Right, and it would seem as if Dr. Ehrman is being selectively independent. He's saying that these sources have an independent origin, but when it comes to what they're looking at, they converge. He's got convergent observation. And that just doesn't seem to hold up among scholars. And he made a statement. He says that we have sources that almost certainly go back to the 30s. He said that in the last snippet that we heard. Can we trace those sources to the 30s?
No, I don't think
maybe?
so. that's predicated on this, I think, arbitrary apologetics-motivated dating of Mark at 70. They're trying to say, well, how long would it have taken these traditions to get to Mark? And 40 years? Then they must go back to the 30s. But this Aramaic argument seems highly dubious to me. He is right that often there is an Aramaic substructure. But one big problem is, even if there was a Jesus, he wasn't the only one who spoke Aramaic. It was the common language. And did it have to even be in Palestine? Aramaic means Syrian, right? Aram was Syria. Syria was a kind of a nickname based on neighboring Assyria. It was in the Old Testament. It's called Aram, and hence Aramaic. And even in New Testament times, it appears that that Antioch in Syria was lingual and multi-ethnic, that there were Jews and Greeks. That becomes a big point of contention in the book of Acts. And and this was, of course, a boiling pot of mystery religions and so on. So it doesn't, if it's Aramaic, it doesn't necessarily mean it came from Jewish Palestine among contemporaries of Jesus. Plus, is he saying that the stories were circulated in Aramaic, or that the gospel, as C.C. Torrey once argued, was itself entirely written in Aramaic and translated into Greek, or who knows what? I mean, we don't know, but you can't date it that way, it seems to me. And once again, it's this circular argument. 30 A.D., hey, that's when Jesus lived. If Jesus lived, that's right. The whole point under dispute.
Exactly.
Guys, I think it's round 6 now. This is unbelievable. I just want to say we have 60 minutes, not even. And I feel like I'm going to have to rewatch this 6 times to get half of the things that you're talking about. You know what I mean? Let's go ahead and do this.
Paul's views of Jesus are really important, as I think Bob and I would both agree. Paul does not talk about a heavenly cosmic figure, Joshua or Jesus, who was crucified by demons in outer space, the way mythicists have often said. Paul talks about a real historical figure, Jesus, a Jew among Jews, a preacher-teacher who was crucified by his earthly opponents. Yes, Paul thought that Jesus was a divine being who was also a human being. Paul does think that Jesus was a divine being who was also a human being.
Okay, before you dig into this, I know this is probably my favorite that I've been sitting on for a while, because it is so interesting what me and Luther, because me and Luther, we talk like almost every day, and probably 2 or 3 times a day. We find time to talk.
We sure do.
We are definitely seeing some interesting things. Robert just dropped, so he'll be calling back in just a second here, Luther.
Okay. All right. But as we wait for him, you were saying some of the things that you and I see, Derek. Yes.
Yes, we're definitely seeing this heavenly figure. Here he is. He's called back in. We're going to go ahead and pull him on. Hold on 1 second. So like I was saying, Robert, you there, brother?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so ultimately, me and Luther are definitely seeing a heavenly figure. Now, it's personified. Of course, we would probably consider it some form of, I would suggest it's probably a planetary type of motion, or planetary, ultimately the source of what this person was, at least to some extent, because there's a lot of ideas, like you said. The New Testament is not just one thing. It's not like, it's just Mithraism. No, there is so much. It's a conglomeration of ideas and evolved ideas and such. But I do think the figure Christ being the light of the world and such, there is some astrotheology there. Is the whole thing ultimately astrotheology? That's a big question mark. But I think, and this is just me, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the idea of a heavenly Jesus as mythicism, or as you and Richard Carrier would definitely agree on, it kind of agrees with what I'm saying about the astrotheology to some extent. And maybe you can emphasize, is Jesus a historical man? According to what Bart's saying, there is no heavenly Jesus. What is the strongest evidence you can make to show what Bart is saying isn't the case, or at least affirm there is a heavenly Jesus and not this earthly one?
Well, the fact that he does not say, Paul does not say, that this is leaving aside for the moment whether there was a single Pauline author and if the historical Paul was one of them. But in the Pauline texts, let's say, there is not, in fact, any reference to human, earthly, political leaders putting Jesus to death. It's amazing there's no reference to that. In the very late, I think, 1 Timothy, which is probably the latest of the three pastoral epistles, it does mention his making the good confession before Pontius Pilate. But this is a very late work, and it probably is basing this on the Gospel of John. But throughout no critical scholars think Paul actually wrote the three pastoral epistles. So I'm not sure that Bart even has that one in mind. But in 1 Corinthians, it says that the archons, the rulers or princes of this world, put to death the Lord of glory, not knowing what they were doing because they were sealing their own doom by doing this, and that this is the secret wisdom that Paul passes on to the perfect, the mature. Really sounded like Gnosticism there. The archons, there is no place in the Pauline epistles where that refers to earthly sovereigns. Of course, there are various references to Caesar and so on, but I believe earthly rulers are called hegemons, or hegemon as we anglicize it. So if that doesn't prove, it couldn't mean that here, but the usual usage is that it's referring to heavenly beings associated with the fallen angels of Jewish lore. In Colossians, it speaks about what was going on at the crucifixion, that Christ was disarming the principalities and powers on the cross, and that the titulus, as it's called, the bill of accusation that was nailed to the top of the post on a cross, said, no, this guy is being crucified for this, a thief or rebel, runaway slave, or seditionist. And that's the point of Jesus of Nazareth would be king of the Jews, right? Well, Colossians doesn't have that. It says that what was on that bill of accusation was the laws of the Torah, which accused us, and that Jesus did away with that. Now, why would that be disarming the principalities and powers? Well, because Gnostics and Marcionites thought that the Torah was given by the archons, the fallen angels, as it says in the letter to the Galatians, that if you have a one man and a group and you're trying to forge an agreement between them, you don't need a mediator. The one man is, in effect, his own mediator, representing himself like in a courtroom. Says you only need a mediator if there are two groups. I'm paraphrasing, but it's clearly what Galatians says. And so the law was given from one group, the elemental spirits, via a mediator, Moses, to another group, Israel. And so that's how, and the whole of Orthodox Christianity and Judaism, as the Gnostics understood them, were false religions foisted upon the human race by the archons, because by people keeping them, they were unwittingly worshiping the angels who gave them. I think that's what it means in Colossians, where it says that people are puffed up by their spiritual exercises, merely worshiping angels. It's the Gnostic claim. Well, to me, all of this makes so much sense in Gnostic terms that, number one, I don't see any reference to earthly sovereigns. And number two, it does sound like the kind of thing that would take place in the heavenly world. It prejudices the case to say outer space, as if mythicists were saying the New Testament writers were members of the Etheria Society or some UFO cult, that Jesus is living on Venus or Jupiter today, as some say. Right? No, it's like more like in the Rig Veda, where it says that before the creation, there was the gigantic human form of Purusha, the primordial man, exactly the same as in the Kabbalah with the heavenly Adam, the Adam Kadmon, who was the pattern for all creation. Well, in the Rig Veda, it said that Purusha sacrificed himself and that his component parts were transformed into all the different forms of matter and life in the present world. And so there is a heavenly sacrifice of a heavenly man that gives life to the world. And you find this in Gnosticism, where pretty much the same thing happens. So this is a well-known mytheme. And it is, of course, tied in with astrotheology and the like, which is probably where the cross comes from at all, with the heavenly dome and the what the heck is it? The procession of the equinox and all that stuff. It seems to me that it fits perfectly into what we know. I think Richard Carrier's made a deeper study of this too. It would be good to see what he thinks about it. But I don't see that as any kind of far-out thing. I mean, it is in the sense that this presupposes a view of the universe that we don't share anymore. But the point is, as with many things, the ancients weren't stupid. This was all the result of scientific theorizing without technology, such as we have. And so it sounds wacky to us, but it wasn't to them. You didn't have to be insane to entertain such ideas. You might today, I don't know, but that's not what they're saying happened, right? They're just saying this kind of mythology is what was historicized into the redemption story of the Gospels.
Let me ask you one little snippet. I know Luther's probably wanting something to comment, but when it talks about him coming in the flesh, two questions, I'm going to pack them into one. There's these ideas, coming in the flesh or born of woman, or these kind of hints that are there that people would say, see, he's a real historical man. I tend to think it's anthropomorphic or something to that extent, but then again, I'm asking the scholar. So these hints that seem to give these suggestions of, he came in the flesh, that means physical body, blood, heart beating, et cetera, and also, does Gnosticism run in the first century, early first century? Is this a possible thing that we're seeing in the New Testament? I mean, kind of wanting to know what your thoughts are on that, because I know they didn't think he was a literal physical man.
Yeah, the passage in 1 John, which says, don't believe any prophet, any spirit, literally, that will not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. That is anti-docetic, it seems to me. I know Raymond Brown and others thought, well, let's not be too hasty, but if it means anything, the only thing we know of in the ancient church that would fit that is Docetism, the view of Gnostics and other Christians who just were so ascetic and thought the flesh was automatically sinful that they thought, well, Jesus couldn't have had stinking flesh. It must have been a kind of a hologram. And you didn't have to be Gnostic to be that super spiritual. But so Docetism occurs in Gnosticism, but not all Gnostics were Docetists. Not all Docetists were Gnostics. Well, the writer of 1 John is trying to combat what he views as heresies. That one and what Bart helpfully dubbed separationism. That's not an ancient term, but we didn't really have a good term for this ancient attested view, namely that there was a flesh and blood Jesus, but he was not the Christ. He was simply the temporary channeler for the Christ Spirit, and this Spirit entered into the fleshly Jesus at his baptism and departed on the cross, which is what Jesus refers to when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or in the Gospel of Peter, my power, why have you left me? Well, so that's separationism. That's why in 1 Corinthians 12 you have this crazy-sounding thing where he says, now, you remember you used to say all kinds of things when you were led astray into paganism, but now, let's be clear, nobody says Jesus be damned by the inspiration of the Spirit any more than you can say Jesus is Lord except by the Spirit. What was going on there? Was this written to the Corinthian insane asylum? Can you imagine people jumping up in a Pentecostal church saying, Jesus be damned? Well, as Origen said, that this must refer to known Gnostic sects that went on for a couple of hundred years, like the Cainites and the Ophites, who cursed Jesus because they were trying to make clear that he was not the Savior. The Christ was, and just a channeler. And these views were there, but 1 Corinthians and 1 John are more early Catholic views that are trying to stomp on this heresy, saying don't believe that stuff. But you have stuff in Philippians and I think Romans, another two of these, where it says that Christ came in the form of sinful flesh, or in the likeness of humanity. Why use that kind of hedging terminology if you mean, as the Gospel of John says, the Word became flesh? So there seems to be some docetism in there. I think John Dominic Crossan says that also. He even said, why do you suppose it is the crucifixion narratives don't just say he died? They say stuff like he gave up the ghost and stuff. Do they really think that he died the way we do? Anyway, I don't know what else he makes of that. But this stuff, these themes were around in New Testament times, and then the question becomes, what were New Testament times? How late are these epistles? And again, I think that's really up in the air. I tend to follow W.C. van Manen, Bruno Bauer, and others who said that none of these epistles go back to the authors to whom they're ascribed. Okay, there presumably was a Paul who was important enough to have people ascribe their own ideas to him, but that he didn't write any of this stuff, and they probably come from the late 1st, early 2nd century. And I think that is so. And the Johannine material is probably just as late. So that complicates the question of, what were New Testament times? Plus the fact, let's just take it the way they usually say it, was Gnosticism a 1st century phenomenon prior to Christianity, or was it a split-off, a spin-off from Christianity in the 2nd century? I can't help thinking that latter view, that Gnosticism was a later development from Christianity, a Christian heresy, I can't help thinking that is the same sort of spin job you have with the mystery religions, the absurd view that the mystery religions copied the dying and rising Savior from Christianity and not the other way around. That the evidence to me is not as clear that Gnosticism preceded Christianity as it is with the mystery religions and their gods preceding it. But it seems to me the same kind of claim, and it does seem to me that there are Gnostic. There are elements recognized as Gnostic in character by comparison to second century Gnostic writings, but they don't. I know this is very iffy, but they sound to me like they come from the internal logic of Christianity, and there was non-Christian Gnosticism, and the Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi show that you had Zoroastrian Christians and Sethite Gnostics and Melchizedekians who added Jesus as kind of an afterthought. And that's certainly a case of Christianizing pre-existent Gnosticism.
Luther,
So Bob, what's that, Derek?
Oh, I was going to say, go ahead, but I know we've got 3 more. Let me see, 1, 2, 3. Sorry, 4 more, and we've got 40 minutes. So just giving you guys a heads up on time. Go ahead, Luther.
Okay. Well, just to be clear, what you said, Dr. Bob, about 1 John. So the argument that whoever doesn't believe that Jesus came in the flesh is not to be received and they're to be Antichrist. Do I understand you to say that that is not necessarily an argument for historicism? That within the context of Christian thinking, there's enough wiggle room in what's actually being said in light of the prominent philosophies within Christianity at the time, not to necessarily say this is a case for historicism?
Well, it certainly is the case that the writer of 1 John, the elder, we don't know what his name was really, that he believed that there had been a historical flesh and blood Jesus. But that doesn't mean he's right. That doesn't mean he has the older view.
Okay,
I see. It just attests that there were his contemporaries who believed in docetism or separationism, a whole different issue as to whose was the older view.
Right, okay.
Interesting. And yes, that is the kind of argument that, for example, what you mentioned, Dr. Price, was how they would make the argument that, no, Jesus, well, look, yeah, we get it, these older mystery religions, if you will, they look a lot like Jesus, but that's because the devil knew. And so it's possible, we're kind of seeing some type of element, what Dr. Price is saying, the late date of that. I mean, scholars are saying, hey, look, this is a way late date. And by then in the 2nd century, historicism is obviously starting to rise. But we're going to move on to round 7, guys, if you're all right.
Sure.
Paul tells us a number of important things about the historical Jesus based on what he knew. He indicates that Jesus was actually born physically, that he had a woman as his mother, that he came from the line of King David, that he was born a Jew, that he was a Jewish Messiah, that he had brothers. One of them was named James. He preached to other Jews. He had 12 disciples. One of them was Peter, whom Paul knew. Jesus was a teacher. Paul explicitly cites several of Jesus' teachings. Jesus had a Last Supper with his disciples. Jesus was crucified by the ruling authorities at the instigation of the Jewish authorities. Paul tells us these things.
So, what do you think?
Well, not exactly. The thing where Jesus was born of a woman born under law, this is an odd thing to assert. Would you say, whatever else you want to say about President Trump, he was born of a human being? Like, who would say this? Anybody? O.J. Simpson, he had a mom. George Washington, he had a mother who bore him once. Oh, really? I'm glad we got that settled. Like, why would anyone say this? Well, it seems to me clear that these things, statements like this, are anti-Marcionite statements, that somebody is, I think Marcionism lies beneath a lot of the Epistle to the Galatians, too much to go into at the moment, but it seems to me that there's certainly signs of interpolation in Galatians, and this was an attempt to head off Marcionite doctrine by, hey, if this is what Paul said, you supposedly Paul Pauline Marcionites have no business saying what you do, that Jesus appeared as an adult, just like beaming down from heaven in Capernaum one day. Well, yeah, if that's what it said, that would rule that out, but it seems like it wasn't. The business about Peter, did he know Jesus had a disciple named Peter? Well, in Galatians, he refers to this character, the one he confronted in Antioch, and the one who was one of the three pillars. He calls him Cephas. Now, there's one place in what is otherwise regarded by some scholars as an interpolation where he calls him Peter. And I think that looks like a scribe who figured Cephas and Peter were the same guy, just slipping and calling him by the more familiar name. But it's not clear to me that Cephas and Peter were supposed to be the same guy at all. And he certainly doesn't say anything about whether the three pillars or any of the, quote, apostles were disciples of Jesus. We're reading in Luke's harmonization of the 12 in the Gospels, the disciples, with Luke's 12 apostles, a phrase nobody else uses. And so that's wrong. This thing, in my opinion, this thing with he knew Jesus had brothers, one of who was named James. There's too much evidence in the apocryphal Acts that people could take the apostles could take the form of Jesus and vice versa, so that people thought they were seeing John, they were seeing Jesus, that they were seeing Jesus, and it was really Thomas. And this occurs in all 5 of the major acts. And in all of them, it sort of implies that, what you see in the Gospels, Jesus says to the disciples when he sends them out to preach, whoever hears you hears me. You had to recognize that this isn't just some guy's idea. These guys are speaking with the authority of the risen Christ. And in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus tells Thomas that he is no longer a mere disciple, but that he and Jesus have kind of merged into the same one because he understands him so well. So I'm not so sure this doesn't mean that. But a simpler explanation is that the brethren of the Lord is in 1 Corinthians 9, just me, and in Matthew 25 and in 3 John, that it means a bunch of missionaries, and that's who he met 2 of, Peter and James. I go into this at greater length than I can here in my book, Bart Ehrman Interpreted. Does he speak of the earthly powers, the governments doing Jesus in? No, he doesn't. As I've just said, does the outrageous thing, though, that these guys always minimize, and I don't understand how, is that Paul does not, what he does say about Jesus seems to contradict the Gospels. He says, well, those Jews demand signs and Greeks wisdom, but we got to disappoint them. All we preach is Christ crucified. Is this possibly a reference to a man who was healing cripples and demoniacs on every street corner, who walked on water, et cetera, et cetera? Well, they seek signs, but we got none of that kind of merchandise. It just seems like it couldn't possibly be. Or Romans 13. Well, we know that God gives the sword to the authorities so that they can keep justice going, and you don't have anything to fear from them if you're a law-abiding person. Could somebody say this if they believed that the Romans had railroaded and judicially murdered Jesus? It seems highly unlikely. Why does Paul, if he knew of the teaching of Jesus, never quote it? There's one passage where people claim that he does about divorce, that I say this not on my own, but by the word of the Lord. If you don't separate from your husband, try to work things out. Does that mean, I remember when Jesus said, I think it was in Nazareth at the time, that you shouldn't divorce. Well, of course, he is said in the Gospels to have well, I don't think it means this, but usually they say Jesus was outlawing divorce except for porneia. But it doesn't say that. And in the same letter, Paul says, if anybody thinks he's such a prophet, let him recognize that what I'm writing here is the word of the Lord. There's no reason to think he means he has the Q document, a bunch of sayings of Jesus at his side, and he never, that's the closest he ever comes to attributing anything to Jesus. Now, how could this be? Well, James D.G. Dunn and many others say, well, maybe Paul was quoting Jesus, but he refrained from saying whom he was quoting. Now, you've got to be kidding me. There's no way you're trying to settle an argument by quoting the risen Son of God and then not say who it is. I mean, you're going to make sure they know it's the ultimate authority. Dunn says, well, it's like, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, you know who I mean. That's just ludicrous, but they're forced to that expedient because otherwise you have to admit that Paul knew of no sayings of any historical Jesus because he didn't think there was any. Now, why are there parallels between the Pauline epistles and the Gospels? Well, because people began attributing Pauline and other sayings to Jesus. Stuff from the book of Revelation, let him who has ears to hear use them. That suddenly becomes a saying of Jesus. And it's like they're picking and choosing stuff from earlier Christian literature and putting it into the mouth of Jesus once they decided there needed to be a historical Jesus to give them the copyright on Christianity.
Right. Things like, I think it's 2 Corinthians, that's where Paul is supposedly quoting Jesus, and he says, as the Lord says, it is more blessed to give than to receive.
That's Acts
what about
16.
That?
That's
16,
Acts
okay.
16.
Yes.
We know that to the degree that Acts and Luke are written by the same guy, and I think it's a lot more complicated than that, it's odd that at first you got the same problem. Why does he mention only this one thing? And it's teaching of Jesus quoted by Paul, whereas it's not in the same guy's gospel. Well, to me, that's the exception that proves the rule. He knew of what were by his day in the 2nd century deemed sayings of Jesus and decided to put them all in the gospel. And this one came in handy because Paul's making an appeal for funds. I guess he wouldn't have to do that if they had Patreon in his day.
Right.
Okay. Now, we've got so many questions too. I'll be honest, we're not going to be able to get to all of them this show. We're going to have to do another show eventually.
Sure.
Maybe off this, me and Dr. Bob and Luther will talk and figure out a good time. But we've got so much already, and we're right now getting in around 8. I mean, you've made statements that even other people like, Dr. Ehrman tried to make a mockery. I got to give you the time to talk if I'm going to mention it. So you mentioned something about you're not positive whether or not a guy named Paul actually wrote any of the epistles that are quote-unquote attributed to him. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe you can go into detail what you mean. And Dr. Ehrman thought it was funny, and then that's when, in my opinion, that's when the debate really just turned sour instead of being fruitful. So you want to go into that just a hair?
Yeah, critical New Testament scholars generally think that there are 7 of the 13 letters attributed to Paul that he actually wrote: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon, and that the others are spurious, written by Paulinists of one kind or another. That was not unusual. There are letters attributed to Diogenes and Socrates by the later Cynics. It was a known genre, and Bart wrote a whole huge, great book about this called Forgery and Counter-Forgery in Early Christian Polemics. Great book. But what von Manen and Bruno Bauer said, well, in fact, F.C. Bauer in the 19th century said that, Paul couldn't have written any but most of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, the so-called Hauptbriefe or principal epistles. And he said there are various disagreements between these and the other epistles to show the same guy couldn't have written them. And von Manen and Bauer said, well, look, if you want to apply the same criteria consistently, the same guy cannot have written 1 Corinthians and Galatians. In Galatians, we hear loud and clear that Paul learned nothing from any human predecessor, but received his gospel directly from Jesus Christ. Just as in 1 Corinthians, by the way, it says that how did he know there was a Last Supper of Jesus? He received it from the Lord. He didn't get it from historical memory. No other apostles told him about it. But in 1 Corinthians 15, we're told that Paul says, remember when I shared with you the gospel which was taught to me, that Christ died and for our sins and was buried and raised from the dead. He said he learned this. He was taught this by those who were apostles before him. Wait a second, that's not what we read in Galatians, where nobody taught him his gospel. And if this isn't the gospel, what is the gospel? The story of the death and resurrection. It just can't be written by the same guy. And there are a number of things that would make the epistles seem anachronistic. For instance, in the last couple of chapters of Romans and in 1 Corinthians, there is a retrospective tone where Paul seems to look back on his finished ministry and say, well, yeah, I planted the seed, but Apollos watered it, or I laid the foundation and Apollos built upon it. What is Paul in the past? I mean, this sounds kind of like in the spurious 2 Peter, where the writer says, who claims to be Simeon Peter. He says, now you remember what your apostles told you, that in the last days mockers will come, and where is the second coming? He says, well, yeah, now it's happened. Wait a second, I thought you were supposed to be one of those apostles that predicted what would be happening in the last days. It's like an anachronism, and there seem to be things like that plus references to how Christianity is now thriving all over the world already in Paul's lifetime. There seem to be references to the fall of Jerusalem. God's wrath has come upon the Jews at last. What else can he be talking about except the fall of Jerusalem in 70? Wasn't Paul supposed to be dead nearly a decade by then? And stuff like that. There are a bunch of things that imply we've got different Paulinists. In fact, von Manen said that these epistles are like patchwork quilts, like the Upanishads, that they've been added to and added to. Granted, we don't have manuscript copies that read much differently, but that's because we don't have any manuscripts from the crucial period when changes would have been made. So they might have been made, but we have to look at internal factors, and these various scholars have done so. Bart ridicules the idea that the sayings that sound like a historical Jesus are all called interpolations by mythicists. And, of course, they're just doing surgical exegesis. Geez, this verse isn't going to fit my theory, so I'll say it wasn't in there. Well, as it turns out, these interpolation hypotheses were first set forth by non-mythicists. Mythicists didn't come up with these theories. So I just don't think Bart was familiar with this. He's so ensconced in mainstream scholarship. The idea of Galatians not being Pauline. This was the view of Rudolf Steck, who was one of the teachers of Karl Barth. This isn't some kind of loony view. It's just that it's not. You can't play the game that mainstream scholarship, let's see which ones Paul really wrote so we can comb them for details and come up with a Pauline theology. Well, we don't know if he wrote any of them. We can't play that game anymore, so let's simply assume that he did write these. I think Bart is just captive. I call it the stuck in the middle with you school of scholarship. He just, I think, just doesn't and can't take seriously anything that he doesn't have a lot of people backing him up on, hence his constant appeals to most scholars think. I don't think he's being dishonest. I don't think he's a spin doctor. I just think there are certain things he's not familiar with and therefore cannot take seriously.
Wow. All right, round 8. Here we go.
The first is one that is central to many of the debates about mythicism. It comes in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, where Paul says that 3 years after his conversion, so this would be, by my chronology, about the year 35 or 36, the Common Era, he says, after 3 years I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. I remained with him for 15 days. Cephas is Peter, Jesus' closest disciple. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. The brother of the Lord. Paul knows Jesus' brother, and he knows Jesus' closest disciple, Cephas. The word brother in the New Testament always means one of two things. A brother means a blood relative who's born to the same mother. That's one of the things it means. In other words, it means what brother means. The second thing it means is, it sometimes often refers to, members of the same believing community who stand in close solidarity.
I feel like you answered some of that already, but if you want to go into just a couple more details,
yeah,
we'll
the
run
only
into
thing
round 9.
Yeah, I'll just add that there is reason to believe that the passage he's referring to is an interpolation, and this was first suggested by a non-mythicist. The idea is that Tertullian and Irenaeus, writing against Marcion, refer to what the text now calls the second visit to Jerusalem by Paul, but it apparently just as they say it's the visit by Paul to Jerusalem, and it's been pointed out that if either of these guys knew Galatians as we read it and had this passage to appeal to, they would appeal to it. Would have appealed to it just as Bart and apologists are doing, and that was added at some point after Tertullian and Irenaeus in order to ward off Marcionism. So we don't know, right? It's all probabilistic. But what should be agnosticism, we don't know what the deal is, morphs conveniently into fideism. Well, if you can't prove it wasn't in the original, I got every right to go ahead and assume that it was. I'm afraid you don't.
Wow. That made me think, Luther. Didn't it make you kind of think?
Yeah, it sure did. Sure did.
Want to go into round 9, gentlemen?
Assuming there.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Second point about Paul has to tell us. Paul understands that Jesus was the crucified Messiah. This is the important point. Paul understands Jesus as the crucified Messiah. Two things to say about that. First, if a first century Jew talks about someone who is crucified, what do they have in mind? Romans crucified people all the time. When people talked about crucified people, what did they mean? You can read any ancient source. Read Josephus if you want to. Read any ancient source. What do people mean when they talk about someone who's crucified? They talk about the same thing time after time after time. They mean somebody that the Romans nailed or tied to a cross in order to publicly humiliate and torture to death. That's what they mean. If Paul said that Jesus got crucified, what does he mean? He means the same thing. He doesn't mean that Jesus was killed in outer space by demonic power circling the globe. He's referring to a death that the Romans inflicted on criminals. That's what everybody means in the first century.
What do you think, brother?
Well, it's kind of circular, too, because there is this astrotheological thing with the one line crossing the other. And It's easy to explain that if it started that way, if you're going to historicize it, it's going to be a wooden cross. But it isn't actually described that way. He's just saying, well, here's what it always means. This may be, and this is what it means in the historicized version, too. But the question is, was there an earlier symbolic meaning? I think there was. I know he's going to go on to say that nobody would have believed in a crucified Messiah unless it had happened to Jesus and they had to make virtue of necessity. Well, we didn't really see this coming, but he rose from the dead, so he must have been the Messiah despite being crucified. That's reasonable, but there's problems with that. Was Jesus crucified as a Messiah, or is the titulus, the accusation bill, part of the frame-up that this guy says he's the Messiah? It doesn't mean he actually did. And, of course, what he does doesn't look like what the Messiah was traditionally supposed to do, according to Judaism of the day. But my big problem here is another whole area of scholarly research that doesn't get a peep in did Jesus exist, namely that the older Messiah concept was derived directly from the sacred king ideology or mythology, whereby every new king of Israel or Judah became the son of God, or God, could be addressed as God, as of the day he was enthroned. I will tell of the decree of Yahweh, Psalm 2 says. He has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Bow down before the Lord and his anointed, or Messiah. And there are various other things. The king is addressed as God in Isaiah and another one of the Psalms and so forth. Well, this was common in these ancient Middle Eastern kingdoms. The Pharaoh is divine, the king of Battlin, and so on. And the king was the earthly representative, almost the earthly avatar of the king of the gods. And every year he would go through a ritual performance reenacting the way Marduk or whoever had become king of the gods, namely by killing the chaos dragon that the older gods were not up to the task of killing. Since the young warrior god, Jehovah, Marduk, Baal, Indra, whoever, had the guts and the power to do it and killed the dragon, they made him the new king of gods, and from the carcass of the dragon he created the world. You have various references to this in the Psalms, Isaiah, Job, etc. And so this seems to have been okay, do this every year, and part of the ritual was an initial humiliation. Part of the myth was that the god was devoured initially, but either fought his way out of the monster or was raised from the dead subsequently, sometimes by his consort. And then he would defeat the dragon and be proclaimed king of the gods, etc. They would do this every year, and to symbolize the temporary defeat by the monster, the king would go up the steps to the temple where he'd meet the high priest, who would box his ears, tweak his nose, slap him in the face, and knock the crown off his head. Why? Well, this was the cycle of nature that was being renewed, as well as the king's mandate to rule. And the idea was he bore the sins of the people that had led to the death of nature. And so he was taking their sins on him, and once he was humiliated ritually, he would be restored, recrowned, and would go into the temple to ascend to heaven, they said, to see the tablets of destiny and learn what would happen in the next year, and thus be able to rule wisely. Well, this is what the ancient Hebrew monarchy, like all the others, was like. And you already have then a Messiah, a son of God, who can even be called God, who is ritually humiliated for the sins of the people, symbolically dying and rising, and then ascending into heaven. I mean, this is part of the annual renewal of the covenant ceremony. Now, this kind of got obscured once Judaism underwent what Margaret Barker calls the Deuteronomic reform. When they were zealous for monotheism, they combined El Elyon, the Father, and Yahweh, the Son, into one God, and demoted the king to merely being a righteous descendant of King David. They didn't want him to be a god. Hence the view of Messiah we think of in New Testament times, a righteous king who has God behind him. But as Barker shows, it looks like these older views never died out among the people. And that they surfaced again as Gnostic mythology and Philo's cosmology and so on. And so the idea of a crucified or at least sin-bearing Messiah who suffers and then rises was by no means absent from Judaism. It's much older than the notion that was orthodox in New Testament times, but remained alive among Christians. And so that's how Jesus was understood as a dying and rising Messiah.
Okay, this has been a filet mignon. This whole program has been meat. This is a very, very heavy steak to swallow, and a lot of the information you have, we literally need to go source material, check this stuff out. We've got one more round. Let's hit this, and then we can get a conclusion going. Guys, there's books by Bart. There's so much stuff. I'm sorry, not by Bart, but Bart has plenty of books too. Robert Price. We need to be checking this stuff out because this should raise some questions. I mean, nonetheless, even if you're a believer and you're listening in, we're not trying to make you not, okay? But this should allow you to want to maybe let me investigate these things. So I'm going to jump into round 10, and then we'll start concluding because we have 10 minutes.
If Jesus did not exist, let's just say, suppose he did not exist, then necessarily the Christians invented him. And so the big question, if the Christians invented Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, the Messiah, the Christ, would they invent the idea that as the Messiah, he got crucified? If you work hard enough at it, you might be able to imagine inventing a God who got killed and raised from the dead, as many mythicists say. But that's not what Paul talks about. Paul doesn't talk about God who was crucified. God was crucified for you. Paul talks about Christ who was crucified. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2. We do nothing among you except for Christ and him crucified. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and following, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and was buried. By the way, he was buried. A little hard to do in the outer space.
Of course, there's a mockery. So go ahead and answer that, Luther. I know you're going to close us out whenever he's done. And, guys, we've got to do another program. This just isn't enough. All right, I'll shut up.
For sure.
Well, I've already said the main thing on that, but let me just point out that in Paul, there is only one place where Christos appears to, even might be a reference to Jesus being the Jewish Messiah. Read, Werner Kramer's Christ, Lord, Son of God, a classic treatment of this, or Lloyd Gaston's Paul in the Torah. Both of them point out that all the places in the Pauline epistles where Christos is used, it seems to be merely a last name. Today it is, the way people seem to think of it. The only exception is in, I think, chapter 9 of Romans. It's talking about the privileges of the Jewish people, and it says, from their line comes Ho Christos, the Christ. Well, that would make plenty of sense if he's saying, the Messiah comes from their people. But on the other hand, he need not mean more than, Christos, synonym for Jesus, was a Jew. Which he was, you could take as pointing toward a historical Jesus, but let's not read the Gospels into the epistles. That he's he doesn't lay any stress on Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, and as I think I said last time, to think that the idea that, the Messiah of Israel has come, yippee, the desire of ages has arrived, oh come, Emmanuel, to think that this would have been any interest to Gentile ex-pagans, or even diaspora Jews necessarily, that it'd be like going and preaching in South America. Have you heard the news? So-and-so has been crowned the rightful Prince of Liechtenstein. Yeah. And why would this have been, why would Messianism, and in fact, that's why Jesus is not ever discussed that way, even in the Gospels, because it doesn't fit the current idea of the Messiah, that the Orthodox one, so to speak, where he is a human king from the right dynasty. Paul, whoever, is always talking about a supernatural being who appeared on earth to do away with sins and all that stuff and mediates now at the right hand of God. Not a historical sounding figure. And why would this, he defeated the demons and all this, what does this have to do with being a Greek or a Jew? In fact, he says it doesn't, right? We're all one in Christ. It's not nationalistic, which the current view of the Messiah was. So I don't see how Paul is even concerned about Jesus as a Jewish Messiah, and maybe using it simply as a name.
Wow.
Right.
And
Bob, as you pointed out, this idea about crucifixion need not be the mundane idea of what the Romans did to their victims. I mean, you look at someone being crucified out there under the sun. The sun is already there. So in terms of astrotheology, there's the remembrance of that, and the idea of the sun being anchored on one of those cardinal of the planisphere or the ecliptic or however you want to call it. It's easy to think of crucifixion in other frameworks than the traditional Roman framework that Ehrman is suggesting. I've got just a quote here I'd like to share. Maybe we could kind of go out with this. And then, Bob, we'd love to have you to underscore the various places where people can get a hold of you, how they can contact you, how they can donate to your cause, how they can support you. But here's a quote, and this is from William Deaver. He's an eminent archaeologist. You may be familiar with him. Mm-hmm. And he reminds us of this sobering idea. He says the Bible, and he's talking primarily here about the Old Testament, was written long after most events had transpired, in some cases centuries later. Not only that, it was written by a handful of elites attached to the temple and the courts in Jerusalem, so it was not representative of the majority of the people. It was written by men. Do you think we'd have a different Bible if it was written by women? And Deaver says, oh, yes. And finally, he says the Bible is an idealistic picture of what Israelite belief and practice should have been like had these fellows been in charge, but they never were. The Bible is a minority report. And so we're dealing with layers here of portraying a story. It's not straightforward, probably not historical. How do you respond to that?
Oh, yeah, I think that's true. The late, great Philip R. Davies said that. He says, who could have written this stuff but the elite scribes? And who were their intended readers? Each other. Who knows if, I mean, a lot of the stories in the Old Testament must have been popular campfire tales, but most people wouldn't even have known it. And my guess is that the laws of the Torah, most people would never have heard of them. It's like Plato's Republic. As Deaver says, this is the way certain elites wanted it to have been. Did anybody ever live by that stuff? I doubt it. Except Hasidic Jews today.
Well, guys, we're right at the end. Go ahead, Dr. Price, please tell us, how do we get a hold of your stuff? How do we best support you?
Well, I get no royalties from my Prometheus books, but they're on Amazon, and I recommend them, obviously. The ones that are published by us here in Selma are from Mind Vendor Press, and we do get a decent amount from that. But any of my books, I'd be happy for you to buy and read. I have a Patreon account. Just go to Patreon and put Robert M. Price there, and it'll show you how to become a patron. I really, that is an enormous help to to us here. And then there's PayPal also. And I'd like you to listen to the Bible Geek. And though I may not be doing one for a little while since I have sort of serious tooth damage from a recent fall onto the sidewalk, and it's a little more difficult to do these things.
I'm sorry.
But I would like to, and you can look on the web pages you've already mentioned, where I have archives of sermons, articles, stories, and all kinds of stuff I've written for many years past.
Well, I'm a huge fan. So is Luther, and you've got me wanting to look into so many things. I know Luther's going to be able to read a lot, and we'll be getting more of your material for sure. Luther, you want to close us out, brother?
Well, what more can be said? Bible Geek, official website, robert.m.price.com. Check him out on Facebook, Patreon page. We were delighted, Bob, to have you with us today on the Water Boys, and thank you so much for coming by. You made it a great night.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it was great fun.
Our guest today, free thinker, author, teacher, speaker, debater, anthologist, columnist, editor, podcaster, and heretic. Some would say the number one mythicist scholar in the world, Dr. Robert Price. Thanks again. We really loved having you on the Water Boys. We'll see you next time, everybody. Mm-hmm.
My heart skips skipping the beat. You're not close enough, so that space between you and me, let's lose it. The way you're dancing, swaying to the music, girl, that body and how you move it. Every time you cross my mind, girl, I lose it.
Alexa, play the Country Heat playlist.
Okay. I don't think you know what you're doing to me. You got
With Amazon Music, a voice is all you need. Get tens of millions of songs. Download the Amazon Music app today.